Hello and welcome back to Parley. Vampbug paid for this one. If you're not them, I hope you'll enjoy listening. Vampbug says, March Parley, it's another D&D one, the simple weapon table for D&D 5e. It's a little ugly. Here's a link to a reasonable visual of it. In particular, I have gripes with the club and sickle. I'm not going to show the visual of the 5th edition one just to avoid any issues anyway. Both are 1d4 light weapons, the club and the sickle, with no other qualities, but there exist counterparts to them, the light hammer and the hand axe. The light hammer gets the added benefit of having the thrown property while retaining the damage type and damage die of the club, while the hand axe gets all that and an increase in damage die over the sickle. There are fringe rules texts where the club and sickle are mentioned, where the light hammer and hand axe are not. Sickles can be monk weapons, and clubs are affected by the druid's shillelagh. Shillelagh. But I will ask to ignore that for the rest of the parlay. Shillelagh only seems to affect one weapon anyway, no respect for dual-wielding clubs. Preamble out of the way, I made a simple weapons table and I want to hear your thoughts on it. I've done zero playtesting so far, but I did remove the sickle and club, so I find the table a whole lot neater. Oh, also there's simple reach weapons and the blowgun in there. Go nuts. Excellent. Lots to respond to there. The first thing I want to respond to is to interpret the spirit of a request you made. You said, I will ask you to ignore, fringe rules texts where the club and the sickle are mentioned. Technically, they might have an advantage. I'm going to interpret the request there. You don't seem to want me and the other listeners to hand-wave the existence of the club and the sickle simply because technically there exists a place where the weapons have different benefits, because I'm interpreting it's not enough of a place. Why do there need to be so many options that have barely any but technically one or two places where they're better than other things? Why can't you still create interesting opportunity cost by condensing the weapons? And I completely agree. However, I do still think it's relevant that they have different benefits, because I think we can maybe learn from that design and do something good there. For example, I think the spirit of the weapon table isn't necessarily so bad. The spirit of the weapon table is that there are different options, different reasons to use them, different flavor to the options, and getting into why there would be a weapon table and different options in it will definitely help to make a better one. So I don't think it's irrelevant or to be completely ignored, as much as I agree with you if that's what you mean, that that's not a good reason for there to be a bunch of different weapons that, by the way, like, if that's the only place that weapon's relevant, why doesn't it just literally say that? This is worse than blank 100% of the time, except when you use this monk thing, and if the player picks up a random club, of course we need the stats for a club, or you could just make them up. But, if the player is choosing them, right? So I'm completely on board with that. I just wanted to get out of the way this idea that, why would Vampbug and I think this is bad? Why is it bad to have lots of options? If they don't do anything bad, they're just kind of the same. Why is that bad? But anything that overwhelms the player and creates more little factoids to learn is bad until proven good in game design. That is my philosophy anyway. If there don't need to be a lot of different elements, then it's bad if there are. It's automatically bad. If you have the player learn a bunch of information, but they don't need to learn a bunch of information to create the fun that you're using that information for, it is bad to have that information in there. Some types of people, like myself, are very good at intaking that type of information, and we might sometimes not notice that it is bad to do that because it's just easy for us to do it. But let me put it another way. You're hanging out with your friends and you want to play a board game with them, but the board game has a lot of rules. Wouldn't you agree that it would be easier to convince them to enjoy it or to not overwhelm them if it didn't have a lot of rules? And then the only reason you'd be willing to convince them to play it, even though it has a lot of rules, would be because you think it's really fun, right? But let me ask you, if we could demonstrate that it could be fun that way with less rules, In what way could that possibly be inferior? Like, it would be good to reduce the number of rules, you know? There are, of course, perceived benefits we won't get bogged down with, like people wanting gatekeeping. It's difficult for people to enjoy the thing they enjoy if it's unnecessarily complicated, but that isn't a true benefit. People who think that they like that don't know that they're worse off than if they gave up that toxic desire of theirs. So we're not going to get bogged down with that. I will briefly show you the table that vampbug supplied. We'll come back to this much more later, but this is the table. I have to say, you're right, it is a lot crisper. It's very crisp. I will point out that this is currently simple weapons, not martial weapons, and there's a distinction, and I think we should talk about that too. But before we get into this too much, I want to talk about what you even could do with weapon design, possibly referencing this a little bit. So, if you're not familiar, a quick crash course in 5th edition's kind of weapon situation. When you have a weapon in 5th edition, let's say I choose to have a short sword, it has a damage die, which is how much damage it does when it hits. If it's a melee weapon, you by default use strength. If it's a ranged weapon, you by default use dexterity. And that determines both your accuracy and how much damage you do with it. If a weapon has the finesse property, it's a dagger, let's say, the idea is that flavorfully, you don't need to be very strong to wield this weapon skillfully, so you can use strength or dexterity. You can imagine how a strong person with a dagger would maybe be more dangerous, but you could also be more dangerous if you were a not strong but very dexterous person with a dagger, right? And so flavorfully, that kind of makes sense. A rapier is another common 5th edition example of a finesse weapon. You can imagine that being strong is relevant to hurting someone with a rapier, but being dexterous is also definitely relevant. And so while you can't use both, although maybe it'd be cool if you could somehow employ both, you get to pick which one you use. You can use a melee weapon and hit hard like a strength-based character as a dexterity character, provided that you use weapons that do that. One of the balancing components I think is potentially good in the 5th edition weapon table is that strength-based weapons you must use strength to use, tend to have higher damage die because dexterity is overpowered in 5th edition. You get armor, the ability to dodge of very common types of danger, and also potentially your attacking stat using dexterity. Dexterity is one of the most multitasky stats. You can definitely just build all dexterity on a character to the extent that it's even possible to do that. And that is, if anything, probably the most multitasking stat you could get, barring some specific subclass stuff. So it's appropriate that strength should have some strength, and it does, which is that the strength-based weapons hit harder. They hit harder. I'm not sure that's enough. I don't think it's at all enough to make it, sort of worth using them instead. But they do have significantly higher damage. You can hit for pretty big damage if you use a lot of strength. Another aspect of the weapon design is that they can be two-handed. Weapons sometimes have a quality called versatile, and then they'll have a damage die. This means if you hold it with two hands and hit someone, you do, more damage, different damage die. So a quarterstaff, for example, 1d6, or you can plop someone on the head with both hands, and that's 1d8. The damage goes up a bit. So you get a cost for having to get the damage, you have to have the hand free. You have to have the quarterstaff and not like a shield or a spellcasting thing. We'll get back to that in a minute. But then you can get more damage. Or you can have something like a greatsword that does really high damage, 2d6 damage, but you need two hands to swing it. Or a weapon that has reach. You can hit people 10 feet away, 2 squares away, instead of only 1. But generally they're two-handed or they do very low damage. Something like that, right? So lots of good opportunity costs here, right? There's no weapon that is just the best. That's something that I think the table is surprisingly not that bad at. There are a lot of weapons that are like needlessly inferior. I think the club and the sickle are great examples. What the table is guilty of is not so much making one weapon clearly the best, but making many weapons unclear why they exist. Why do you not pick a rapier, a dagger, a whip, a quarterstaff, or some big chonky two-handed weapon? 99% of the time if you're going to pick a physical weapon, right? You could, that was off the top of my head, that might be missing something. But maybe you need to be holding a sword, a short sword, or if a rapier counts, it would be kind of better. Too many of them are almost entirely inferior except for some really obscure edge case, basically. And that's okay if they're meant to create atmosphere, or you find a weapon, you find a club, and then it's an improvised weapon, so it does lower damage. But wouldn't it be better to just have a rule for improvised weapons, which, by the way, 5th edition does have that? We won't get into that now. I think it's much better to just have those things be handled by one rule that says you do probably 1d4 damage and don't add any modifiers when try to hit, and then you do 1d4 damage with no modifiers or just strength to do damage, something like that. I don't think we need to fill the rulebook with specific stats about that kind of thing. And if the player says, "Hey, this is really close to a weapon I'm proficient with, can I treat it as a rapier?" The DM can decide to say, "Sure," that's fine, right? But the beginning of the problem is that there are a lot of weapons, at least in the 5th edition table, that don't really serve a purpose. Again, there's no clear reason why it would be fun. I would say, but actually I think there are a lot of hooks available for how they could be fun. I just don't think 5th edition grabs those hooks, but you could. So I want to talk about them. Pretty quickly, actually. They're pretty simple now that I've set that up. What's in each hand? The opportunity cost of what's in each hand. You don't have to focus your game on this, but I do, and I think it works pretty well with this type of ruling for weapons. If you need to cast the spell, you either need something that you're allowed to count as a spellcasting focus or a free hand. That's how we do it in my game anyway. That is close, but not exactly how it works in the 5th edition rules. So you need to pay a cost, one free hand, to be a spellcaster, basically. You could do some shenanigans, and people have. If you want to become a spellcaster and use a powerful melee weapon that might take 2 hands, that you might need to pull some shenanigans. You could maybe swing with the greatsword when you need to, and then hold it in one hand while spellcasting. Okay, maybe you might challenge your player whether they can do that. That may be something you'd consider ruling against. I don't think that's a problem necessarily, but maybe they can't just freely spellcast at any time. You know what I mean? It seems a bit strong, and so that's something to think about. Exactly what you do about that, I don't know. We can't get into every single detail because I want to spend half the parlay talking about the weapon table, but you get the idea. It's a knob you can turn. Another example is damage type. Bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. That's what almost all the weapons on the table do by default. But why? It doesn't matter almost all of the time. In fact, I've played 4 official D&D source material games, and it has never once mattered that damage was bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing. Not a single time has it mattered, unless my DM hid it from us or something. But you would think they would say something. I'm not saying that statistically I know whether, like the monster manual, is mostly enemies where it matters or not. I'm just pointing out that if it is there, then it should matter, basically. It either shouldn't be there or it should matter. I don't think it's good to just have it be there because it's there. I considered spending a good amount of time on this parlay talking about why these things are there, but it's obvious why they're there to some people. They're there because they remind the audience that it's Dungeons and Dragons. It feels that way. They're not there for the reason that things should be in a game, which is to make the game more fun. To make the game more fun. That's why game design should be in a game. Because capitalism, a lot of games contain many elements, the goal of which is not solely or primarily to have fun. And in Dungeons and Dragons, you can remove those elements, and you should. So yeah, that's a thing. You could simply remove a bunch of details from the 5th edition table, only subtract and not add, and improve it a lot. And then you'd maybe go rewrite a few features, make monks able to use one more type of weapon, or let Shillelagh affect any wooden weapon in your hands. etc. You know, you could do something like that. And personally, I think that's what I would more strongly recommend doing. What we will ask when looking at vampbug's table is, does this make there be new fun to account for the fact that it is less simple than just removing stuff from the 5th edition table? That is one way you could evaluate that design. Another thing I wanted to note was making two things feel more two-handed, but I kind of highlighted that with the spellcasting thing. If you're a spellcaster and you want to use a big melee weapon, a common thing is you often lose access to a shield. You're holding a melee weapon and you also want to cast spells, but a shield would be good too, and you just don't have three hands. Like, that's a good cost. But if you go for a two-handed melee weapon, it doesn't feel like there's as much of a cost, right? You could just take one hand off, spellcast, and then keep holding the weapon. So perhaps it would be good if there was a cost, or maybe you want to encourage players to use those almost entirely strength-based weapons. Maybe that's okay, because they're not very flexible weapons. You have to make a pretty specific build to enable that strength. But being able to carry around a greatsword and freely cast magic while using it sounds good. Maybe not overpowered. I don't know if that's even much of a thing in practice in role-playing games, but good. That would be something to consider. I'm not sure how much of a problem it is if you focus on hands. But for example, I've thought a lot about adding 2 hand slots to the 5th edition character sheet, and arguing that for character species that have more than 2 hands, that it's very difficult mentally to focus on using more than 2 like things at once. So they could maybe train to do that, but by default they can't. You could do something like that. Anyway, I think that design also compels the player to fill their empty hand in combat. They notice, they kind of think more about the fact that they have, an empty hand. It's sort of a close to a prop to remind the player that immersively in the game world, their character that they are has 2 hands and they're holding a short sword and nothing. They could be holding a shield or a spellcasting focus or something, a grenade, anything, right? And maybe that will get them interested in doing that. Getting the player excited to use part of the game's systems to have more fun because they just want to use those systems is great. And I feel like adding those slots would do that. I feel like showing the player, here's what's in your hands. You kind of write it down somehow, mark it down somehow. That would be good. I think that's enough about thoughts about things that could be good about the weapon table for now. It gives you some starting point. I have more to say about the damage type thing, but I think we're going to get into it when we look at the table. So let's do that now. We'll read through the specific table, and remember, these are only simple weapons. We didn't talk about the difference between that and martial weapons. It's meant to be a role-playing difference, I guess. Your character doesn't have experience using weapons that require more training to use. And then those weapons, I guess, do more damage. What's always been a little odd to me is that when you're a class that uses martial weapons in 5th edition, you have features in your class that make you better with weapons. You already are better with weapons. You don't per se need better weapons. You could use only one of those 2 things to fulfill that goal, is what I mean. You could just make it so martial weapons are a lot better rather than only a little better, or you could make it so martial features are a lot better rather than only a little better at making you good with weapons. Think fighting styles, for example. But then martial weapons are not a different thing from simple weapons. That would really condense the table. So unless there's a compelling benefit for it being both, I am critical of that piece of design. But you can see how 5th edition is getting a bit of an unfair rap here. I was harsh saying it's designed that way, not primarily motivated by being fun, but so the customer believes it is D&D and it feels D&D like, and that's not, capitalism, hashtag capitalism. That's harsh. It's very easy to look at a game like that and say, okay, but what can we remove to make it as simple as possible without losing what we who've already played it are having fun about that. That is a very easy form of game design. That's not bad. I feel kind of bad. It's a bit harsh to fifth edition slightly unfairly when it's helping us out a lot there. But yeah, anyway, let's look at these weapon options. But martial weapons, that's kind of a floating question. So it's a simple weapon table. Light hammer, 1d4 bludgeoning, and you can throw it. It's got a normal range of 20 and a long range of 60. We got a dagger. It works the same as the dagger in 5th edition. You'll notice that this is a better hammer, a better light hammer. It has the same properties and the same damage, but it does piercing damage instead of bludgeoning. Is bludgeoning damage better than piercing in some situations? You could think about that. It's got the finesse property, which could be a pretty big deal. You could argue that doesn't make it much better. So this is just the basic, piercing option. And that seems to be what it is. What you've done here is potentially fleshed out a basic 1d4 bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing option that all have different merits if bludgeoning damage is good, basically. The piercing one is a finesse weapon, and the slashing one says +2 to hit when used as a 2-weapon fighting bonus attack. I guess this is flavorfully because you can get it's easiest or non-committal to slash rather than hitting someone or stabbing someone. If you just gash them, that's like easier to do while dual wielding. Maybe, yeah. I'm not totally yes or no on that personally. It's an interesting benefit. It's moderately powerful. Normally in 5th edition, if you are dual wielding and you're not trained in 2-weapon fighting, the second weapon isn't as potent at doing damage. This makes it much more accurate. It doesn't make it do more damage, but it gives it a bonus to hit. It will very reliably hit, but it still does inferior damage. It can be pretty powerful to use 2 weapons when playing a rogue in melee range. Rogues can apply sneak attack damage, a big pile of damage, once per round by kind of getting in on the opponent and doing some dirty fighting with various techniques. And because they apply it only once per turn, you might think, oh, go for only 1 weapon attack, go for a ranged attack, which has its merits. But it can be valuable to hit twice, because if the first one misses, you have a backup hit. And this weapon would be an unusually good backup weapon because it's extra accurate to ensure you land that sneak attack damage. It's just an example of where a weapon could have a niche. In 5th edition currently, there are also feats for each of the 3 types of damage, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. And you could argue that the bludgeoning one is pretty good, and so the bludgeoning weapon kind of gets power from there. I am never the biggest fan of that design because it encourages the player to go through an unnecessary 2-step learning process where they look at them and say, wow, the bludgeoning one is literally just inferior in every way. Why would I pick that? The enfranchised player knows that eventually the player will realize that bludgeoning is sometimes good because there's feats that do the bludgeoning thing. It's the Crusher feat, I believe, the Crusher feat, but they don't know that yet. And so they'll eventually find out, but I don't know. I just feel like some perk being attached to it seems good. Perhaps it, I don't know, can be thrown farther. Does that really make sense? Maybe it makes sense. Something like that. I don't know. That it feels good to add a benefit of some kind, so that they're not right next to each other and they feel inferior to each other. I hope I don't miss anything. By the way, I really like that you added flavor auctions, auctioning off some flavor options to the slashing blade, work in progress, what name it is. You said it could be like a knife, a sickle, a kama, a katar, a wrist or forearm mounted blade. Those are examples of the type of thing that you're imagining. That's useful as a design thing. Don't have much to say about that. I just think that's mostly good. Rather than making the name be limiting, having it be open-ended. Maybe it could just be like bludgeoning weapon, piercing weapon, slashing weapon, and then it has suggestions next to it. It's debatable if a name helps. I've had players before have a disconnect that daggers are piercing rather than slashing. A dagger is mostly useful for piercing, but you can certainly slash someone with a dagger, I've had players say. We'll get back to making weapons be able to do one of 2 damage types in a minute. quarterstaff. This is the same as it normally is, I believe. Um, you said 1d6 bludgeoning, versatile 1d8. That's how it is normally, I believe. I think it would be useful to give weapons the wood property if you're going to enforce that with Shillelagh. Shillelagh buffs a weapon, but it has to be made of wood, basically. There are very ambiguous options by default, in my opinion. Making it so it's clear would be good, like what the material of the weapon is. Metal, wood, possibly something else, but most of them would be those things. Or like an edged weapon. Does it need to be sharpened? Do you care about that? Is it worth it? Adding in those parameters makes the game more complicated, but I would argue that for things like wood, it actually removes unnecessary confusion. And for metal, there are a number of spells like heat metal, shocking grasp for metal armor. You could tag armor that way, where it actually would add clarity. But things like it being edged and needing to be sharpened, it adds immersion, but you are paying a cost in terms of complexity. Do you want that level of depth? Is that good? Again, vampbug hasn't added it, but I'm just saying you can see how you could just add a bunch of tags to the weapons, but I wouldn't go too far with doing that. I don't think that vampbug has gone too far overall. I am nervous when a weapon has a block of text next to it, like +2 to hit when used a 2-weapon fighting bonus attack. I think that's easy enough to remember, but I'm the type of player you shouldn't ask about whether that's too complicated. You know, like of course, I'm gonna say like, yeah, it's fine, it's simple, but that's me. Okay, hunting spear. It's a piercing weapon. It's versatile again, can be 1d8, and you can throw it. Again, we have the piercing option is superior to the bludgeoning option if you only read this page. Not necessarily saying that's bad, or maybe I'm just really badly missing something. But I personally think it's not bad to give the player some kind of a little bit to help them understand why that would be. Why is this one just worse than another one? I'm not saying that can't be good. Again, we can get to damage type stuff in a minute. And then the hand axe, 1d6 slashing. It's a light weapon still, so this is still a light weapon, easier to do wield, and it's got the thrown property. It's basically an upgraded slashing blade or dagger, kind of. Upgraded hammer that does slashing damage. You can still use a light weapon, and it's 1d6. That's good. You can throw it. That's good. You can see these have simple but versatile benefits, and the player might find themselves thinking, well, I want to use thrown weapons, I want that option, and so they have a little subset, and then they'd be picking from a few options. There's a meaningful choice, but if there's something they want, generally it's there. That seems good. Okay, continuing on, the mace, 2d4 -1 bludgeoning. I don't like the -1 or +1 in here because I think that it adds a math step that adds up over game time. I think it's good to eliminate if possible. I would almost argue the lower of 2d4 is faster. I'm not sure that's not the same. I'm just giving an example. 2d4 -1. So the average of 2d4, the average of 1d4 is 2.5. So 5 -1, 4. 4 average damage, which is similar to the 3.5 average damage of the previous kind of tier of weapons, quarterstaff, hunting spear, hand axe. So it's a little, it's pretty reliable. It should do that damage at the same time. You roll more die and kind of average it somehow. It's going to be a reliable weapon, sure. You said a mace can be a 1d6 bludgeoning club with the light property. I'm tempted to say that makes it more confusing. It's better to add a line to the weapon list than to say, you could also have it be this other weapon that has almost its own set of properties. I think I want that as another line. I get that they're kind of the same thing. Like it could be just a lighter mace, but I like that being a separate thing. The spear is 1d10 piercing. It has reach, two-handed. You need two hands to use it. And it has a special property. Now, 1d10 with reach and two-handed is powerful, so the special property is going to be some kind of nerf. to make it a little bit less powerful. When attacking a target within 5 feet of you, you don't add your proficiency or strength mod to the attack roll, so it's less accurate when you attack enemies that are right next to you. You need to be in its ideal range. It can hit enemies 10 feet away, but if you don't hit enemies exactly 10 feet away, they're 5 feet away instead, it's worse. A lot less accurate. Still good damage, but the accuracy loss is probably not worth it. It would be better unless you're willing to enable its ideal range to use a different weapon. Cool, yeah. I think it's exciting maybe to the player that they get to use a weapon that does high damage as a simple weapon, but they need to be able to play in its ideal range. I worry that in practice that actually would be pretty powerful because there are a lot of ways to enable that type of thing. I'm thinking there would be weird situations where you'd find sorcerers with tempestuous magic being able to kind of effortlessly achieve the range they wanted, or you could do things like, off the top of my head, put bonfire, the cantrip bonfire, is that what it's called? Bonfire? Right in front of you, and then enemies that try to get within 5 feet of you stand on fire and take a big bongo damage. In close quarters, that seems very easy to enable. It does take a round to set up the bonfire. You could put it on the enemy and then just move within 5 feet of them, and then they can either stand there and burn to death or walk away. You get an opportunity attack, and they're forced into your ideal range. It seems not that hard to enable that. I like that it's a drawback. I worry that it's not that difficult to work around the drawback. But you could argue that's a reward for the dedicated player. I guess I just feel like from a role-playing perspective, that feels quite martial. You know what I mean? Like that training, I guess it's you enabling it with your magic. Maybe that's fine, As you're listening to me talk about it now, you can hopefully decide more easily too. When someone else criticizes something, it can make it much easier for you to think, no, that's fine. Like, who cares, Sandy? That's great. Go with that. Make your game like that. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that. I think that's good. I still feel like it mostly depends on martial weapons. We're just letting you have a tier higher of damage. The larger half of the damage die, that's what damage die those weapons use. And they aren't inconvenient to use, right? Is that the martial weapon thing? I think it would feel great if that's true. If a one-handed simple weapon never goes over 1d6, 1d6. Yeah, and then 1d8 can be something that some of the weapons do in the simple weapon category, but they generally need to be two-handed or they have a drawback. Maybe the spear going down to 1d8 feels more reasonable, but it is two-handed. It's got reach though. I don't know. That'd be nice, but I guess it could be you could have 1d8 in both categories, and then most martial weapons are doing 1d10 or 1d12. Some of the one-handed martial weapons would do only 1d8 damage. That feels resonant. It would feel like, oh, you're seeing the damage die has jumped up from simple weapons. That seems really nice as a intuitive piece of game design. But yeah, not at the expense of, if it makes it that much easier to balance things, then, maybe that's fine. It makes the spear stick out. Maybe that encourages people to enable it. The scythe. This one interested me. This says 1d6 slashing. It's a reach two-handed weapon. A lot lower damage than the spear. It's got a special property. When attacking further than 5 feet, you do 1d4 damage instead of 1d6. So you get a two-handed weapon with reach, and it doesn't have a disadvantage to hitting enemies when you hit within 5 feet. So it's pretty versatile, but you have to commit two hands, and it does less damage if they're further away. Would a scythe do less damage if they were further away? But from a balance perspective, I get it. I think I would need to wield a scythe to feel comfortable judging that game balance. But overall, okay. This is an interesting, different way to balance the weapon. I'm tempted to say make it the same drawback on both because it's easier to remember. But if these are particular enough weapons, that's all right. If you do my thing from before where you give them a place on the character sheet that is dedicated to them, maybe it's more okay for them to have a slightly more complicated kind of affix to them. But I will do a little bit of a denouement at the end of this parlay about things you could do without adding stuff like this that I think do make the weapon choices more meaningful. Um, I but I don't think that's a weird piece of design. It's interesting to have the weapon do less damage further out as a drawback. It doesn't do particularly high damage at any range, but it is in some ways the most versatile weapon so far. One might ask why not use the thrown weapons and carry more of them, but it depends what you consider to be the cost of taking a weapon out as well. Generally, 5th edition uses one free object interaction, so you can take a weapon out, and that's your free object interaction. You can draw a sword as you attack with it, but only once per round. Opening a door as you're moving, a free object interaction. But if you do more than they take an action, you, for all intents and purposes, kind of can't. That's a huge cost. I've considered maybe it should be a bonus action before. You as a gentler cost if you need to do another free object interaction, or you can spend movement to do it. Spending movement to do it seems like it would probably be overpowered in some cases. I think you need to spend an action of some kind, but maybe a bonus action. That could help with that kind of thing. Dropping weapons has frequently been called completely free. You can just, hit an enemy with your greatsword and then just drop it. Use a free object interaction to equip a shield, and then cast magic, and you get everything. And through some weird juggling of items and throwing your weapon on the ground, you can, not have to worry about what's in your hands. Which I think that's all a bit much. I like the suggestion of the player maybe needing to roll to see if their items break somehow, or they need to do a sleight of hand check to see if they can actually do all of that. They quickly equip a shield, but just slide it right on there. Maybe after hitting with a greatsword and then throwing it on the ground, and then, I mean, if you drop a big weapon and it's near you, I'm not sure you're not hurt a lot of the time. Anyway, let's read the rest. They're ranged weapons. Blowgun, it's 1 piercing. You need ammunition. It's got the loading property. Without another trait, you can only fire once per turn. The range is not good. 25 feet, or you have disadvantage. You can attack within 100 feet, but you have disadvantage. 25 feet is short, but the idea is special. Missing with an attack does not reveal your location if you are hidden. Cool. The idea, I guess, a player of mine is using a blowgun. They will forage for herbs and stuff, or collect poison from enemies they kill, and use it to tip blowgun darts. So this can be quite powerful. Until you hit, you're losing poison resources, but you are not revealed because it's silent. And then when you do hit, as long as you make that count, you're a rogue and or it's poisoned or whatever, then you can really make the most of that. Really cool. It inspires a whole strategy, which I think is great. I almost think you could make it silent. You could just say it's silent. And then, yeah, if you miss, they don't see. Almost always. But if it hits them, they, it hurts and they look in the direction. Or something. But besides simplifying it, again, I'm just freaking out about having too much text. To be harsh on that. If it doesn't need to be there, it shouldn't be, but that doesn't mean I think it's a bad idea. Sling, 1d4 piercing, ammunition range. It's got slightly better range, barely better range, and it does 1d4 piercing. It's a basic ranged weapon. I've handed this out to a Pact of the Chain familiar before and had it use magic stone with a sling. That was memorable. Darts, I love darts. It's a finesse weapon, and it's got a kind of short thrown range. This allows you to throw a weapon, use something as a ranged weapon that can be used with strength or dexterity. That's interesting. They're very similar to daggers, except they count as ranged weapons, so they're enabled by things like the archery fighting style. I've always felt like that wasn't a big enough distinction. Maybe it should just be a subclass of dagger, like people flavor it as a dart, but it's a dagger, and the archery fighting style should just be when you attack at range, or it should just be like a ranger fighting style. When you attack at range, you get the bonus. It doesn't have to be with a ranged weapon, because if the player can come up with attacking at range with non-ranged weapons consistently, I don't think that's bad. I think that could be rewarded. That could be a way to simplify it. You're beginning to see how this gets out of hand because you would need to change lots of other things about 5th edition to anyway. Short bow, 1d6 piercing. It's got much better range, but it's two-handed. And then you've got the crossbow, the light crossbow, 1d8. My thing is a little small, so I'm just going to double check. 1d8. It's got the loading property. The idea being if you have multi-attack, you can attack twice in one turn. You need a special ability to be able to load it fast, or you can't fire it more than once per turn. Reloading a crossbow can be hard, but I definitely agree that as a simple weapon, you would do more damage with it. Short bow as a simple weapon. I guess a mostly untrained person can probably hurt someone with a short bow. 1d6? Yeah, I guess. Maybe that's fine. I think we want a bow as an option. It's nice to have more ranged options. And the range is a lot better. They're both two-handed. The ones that do meaningful damage are two-handed. So there's a real cost to ranged weapons. You could, and I don't think we have the time to, it would be like the whole parlay if we'd done this. You could compare this to the sort of meta of weapon choices in 5th edition, like before you made this table. And I think that would only serve to highlight more 5th edition stuff you might want to change. So I decided not to do that with this parlay, but if you'd like that in the future, that's something we, I guess, could do. I'm not sure I agree that it's helpful. The main thing I wanted to say is that I think damage types are the real hurdle. You can see it feels good to have there be different types of weapons. I think there's something resonant about there being different types of weapons. A dude dual wielding 2 hammers and he beats the crap out of people and bashes in people's skulls through their armor because it's a blunt weapon that might be better at dealing with that, with 2 big mallets. It sounds badass. Like, it feels like a nice fantasy trope. You got your dagger death dealer rogue guy. You gotta have daggers. You know, there's, from a role-playing perspective, from a pure flavor perspective, we can agree that we probably need weapons like that, and it doesn't really make sense for one to do that much more damage than the other, like a simple bludgeoning weapon and a simple piercing weapon. So I feel like that's a compelling reason to say there should be a meaningful difference between those damage types. This probably means that you just need to get very aggressive with enemy resistances. There need to be way more enemies that resist at least one of the 3 physical damage types, and a lot of weapons, a lot of enemies that are vulnerable to one of those weapon damage types. If 50+% of enemies are vulnerable to one of the 3 physical weapon damage types and also resistant to one of them, I feel like that's enough, basically. I think the ideal would be that the player either feels like because they need to use a particular weapon to do their death dealing, they have some kind of drawback that is beyond just what's on the weapon, like it's because of that type of weapon, because of bludgeoning, because of slashing something. Another quick thought, slashing weapons making more of a mess is I think meaningful a decent amount of the time. It's generally much messier to dispatch a target by slashing them than by stabbing them or by bludgeoning them. That feels like it could be meaningful fairly easily a good amount of the time. So that's a simple example. Bludgeoning an enemy might be loud in a way that it wouldn't be loud to kill enemies with by stabbing them. The idea that piercing is a very subtle way of killing people seems good. That seems like a place to start, you know. A lot of range weapons are piercing. Maybe it's less available to have melee piercing weapons. Maybe there just aren't like as many piercing options. That's a thought. Things like that, both making enemies vulnerable or resistant to those things and making the players gain some general atmospheric advantage from those things, making it feel early in the campaign like when someone hits with a bludgeoning weapon, you hear it. When someone hits with a slashing weapon, you see the blood, you know, stuff like that. And there's various trade-offs to those things. Piercing weapons being mostly ranged really is starting to appeal to me. And then daggers. There's no high damage piercing melee weapons, or maybe not simple weapons, something like that. And then the rapier has a big benefit that it's subtle, it's not loud or messy, and it does good damage as a one-handed weapon. That seems good. And I like that kind of benefit. I like it because it isn't just gamifying to pick your weapons. It's thinking about what it would be like to fight with that weapon. I feel that's immersive in a way that still attaches to the game balance. It's still relevant to the game balance. That seems good to me. Now, what enemies do you make vulnerable or resistant to bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing? I feel like that's kind of the biggest problem. If you use ruminants, like just animals in the wild, basic atmospheric, low magic fantasy animals, right? I'm not convinced that many of them would be particularly resistant or vulnerable to like any type of damage, you know? I don't know. Maybe slashing weapons would be intimidating because they see the spray of blood. Animals respond to the sight of blood, I think, besides humans. Hmm. Yeah, no, I mean that's hard. It's easy to imagine for things like a treant, an animated tree. Probably bludgeoning is more effective and slashing and piercing are less effective because it's got bark. Armored enemies, you could have some interesting mechanic by which bludgeoning is generally more effective, but if you can get in the gap, maybe you have to roll to hit by more than normal, then your piercing weapon is really good, but slashing weapons are just bad. That seems good, or you could just have piercing weapons be neutral. Having those enemies be vulnerable to bludgeoning but weak to slashing, I mean, defended against slashing, seems good. So there are some examples, but making it happen often enough seems a little tricky. Another final note is that it risks getting your players feeling like they need to remember stuff like this if it isn't intuitive. This isn't the same as an enemy having an elemental weakness. Banshees being vulnerable to water or something, cold. I'm literally just picking something at random. Would for a player who maybe there's lore about banshees that says they have an elemental weakness in real life or in game. But for the player that doesn't know that, that's they just guess or try things or notice. And unless the players have been given or forced to have a variety of different elemental damage types, I don't know if I like that as much. I generally am not very high on lots of elemental weaknesses and resistances, except for things like poison. I feel like is a kind of chemistry one that I like having some weird resistances to. It feels a little more physical. But for weapons, especially because in most cases the player could literally just have another weapon that is the other damage type, or know there are treants in the woods which are, resistant to piercing and slashing damage. So buy a club before you go into the woods. Like that's fine. But if the player has built a storm sorcerer that is all thunder and lightning damage, and then they fight enemies that resist that damage type, like either use the DM just can't use those enemies, or that player just can't use their entire kit. It just does it. There's really no gameplay. And again, if it's that they have to find the lore, it just means they learn after almost dying one time that they need to talk to the old man in the village to find out what banshees are vulnerable to or something. I don't know. That could be fun. I could see how that could be fun, but I think the physical damage type thing works better. It feels more real. We humans have plenty of experience with physical damage types being useful. I was trying to get nutmeg that wasn't ground the other day because I didn't want little bits of nutmeg in my syrup, but I wanted nutmeg in my syrup. And generally, you get a nutmeg and then you grate it, or you have ground nutmeg in a little jar. And I thought, I want like medium to small pieces of nutmeg that are not powder. And so I hit it with a hammer, and it broke surprisingly easily because nutmegs are resistant to slashing and piercing damage. Duh, I thought to myself, except I didn't think that because who knew nutmegs were so easy to crush? Anyway, the point is that we have some experience with that. Okay, we're literally that's all I have. I hope that's helpful in some way, just to give you some uh, ideas. I wanted to briefly suggest weapons that can choose a damage type, basically axes. An axe is often used like a hammer, but you can obviously also slash with an axe. I think letting the player literally just pick when they attack which damage type. It could make axes a pretty interesting weapon. I think axes are a fun fantasy thing. I don't know. And thrown weapons. Maybe we just need more support for specific types of weapons. I don't know. Um, Super lastly, fighting styles for exact specific weapons, techniques you can only do with a sickle, only with an axe, only with a dagger. So you can add that complexity for players that want it without writing it in the weapon table. Okay, I swear that's it. That's the last thing. I'm done.